1, The Problem of Nuclear Weapons. That's the reading you just finished. Let's go ahead and get into some of the details of it. So the atomic bomb is the start of nuclear weapons on a large scale. The United States was the country that created the atomic bomb. It started with the Manhattan Project. On a larger scale, though, this is a World War II creation. Hitler is somebody that was looking for a super weapon that could be extremely destructive, and it just so happened that the United States was the country that beat him to the punch and created this atomic bomb. Even those that were a part of the Manhattan Project were shocked with the first testing that was done with the power it truly had. And after that first test, there are going to be 2 nuclear weapons used. And what I mean by used ever, it means used in warfare or used on another country, not tested. We're going to see a video about nuclear weapons tests, and that video shows that certainly more than 2 nukes have ever been used, but it's going to be 2 nukes have ever been used in warfare, and they were both on Japan in World War II. All right, with that destructiveness that happened near the end of World War II in the Pacific, World War II comes to an end, and shortly thereafter, the Cold War and the arms race comes to be. 2 of the most powerful countries that came out of World War II were the Soviet Union and the United States. And eventually, the United States and the Soviet Union butt heads. It doesn't take very long, but eventually they butt heads, and they really come to, this really comes to be an international foreign policy battle once the Soviet Union creates their own atomic bomb as well. And that's it right there. That's when you get the Cold War, and then that's when you get the beginning of the arms race. So early on here, you see the United States is going to create NATO, so North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO for short, NATO. And it's a treaty between the United States and the European allies. At the same time, you get the arms race. Not the United States is going to increase the amount of atomic bombs, and then increase the amount of nuclear weapons as the whole, as new and more powerful nuclear weapons come to be, and then the Soviet Union will do the same. Throughout the early Cold War period, the 1950s, you continue to have this arms race, and there's a thought behind it, and it's the idea of deterrence. So this is a shift in strategy in the idea that you are going to avoid war if you have more nuclear weapons. So you build up all this weaponry, and by having a lot of weapons, by having a lot of nuclear weapons, no country will want to attack you because they can attack you with nuclear weapons. So that's the strategy, the thought behind deterrence. That, and the United States didn't trust the Soviet Union, so they think the Soviets are going to attack. But if you look back on history, that's the United States point of view. The Soviet point of view is the same type of idea. They think the United States is going to be the country that will attack first, so they need to be ready to respond. And both sides are saying they need to be ready to respond with nuclear weapons. Then into the 1960s we go, and in the early 1960s we get the height of the Cold War with the event that became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happens, the Soviets are taking missiles and they are placing them in Cuba, which was a newly formed communist country, and they did it without the United States knowing. The United States finds out. They use U-2 spy planes that are being used at this time, and they find these missiles in Cuba, and it becomes a worldwide almost catastrophe. This is the closest the United States and the Soviet Union come to nuclear war. 13 days later, everything is over. The Cuban Missile Crisis that does not turn into a full-fledged nuclear war. And it's also an FYI to both sides, Soviet Union and the United States, that this is getting to be a little bit too much. They almost went to nuclear war. Both sides see it. Something has to be done about it. So there's an agreement on both sides to try and reduce some of the tensions. There's a hotline. I always suggest thinking about that. If you ever see that red phone in a movie that the United States has, that's able to directly call Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. That's what I have students envision with the hotline. Is boom, you pick up that phone and you get a direct connection from one leader of a country to another. The point being, communication at this time is really harsh. Nothing like we have at this time, where we can get a hold of someone, no problem, and very quickly. Just this all comes back, though, to the idea that there's a large danger of nuclear threats, and it's become so tenuous that it almost led to a nuclear war at this time. As the 1960s continues, then, we start to see these actions taken by countries that is trying to curtail the either creation or the usage of nuclear weapons, but it's the reaction to the Cuban Missile Crisis, how that became almost a nuclear catastrophe worldwide. So we start to see arms control. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty you see there, the NPT, that was one of the earlier questions in the handout for this packet. But proliferation, the spread of something. So this is a treaty designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. It happens in 1968. So it's trying to put a limit on how many countries can actually obtain nuclear weapons, as opposed to doing something with countries or putting limitations on countries that already have nuclear weapons. Détente. This is a period of time during the Nixon administration in the United States where there's an eased or relaxing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Beneath that bullet point, you see a couple of other treaties that happen or take place, but the idea here is it goes back up to arms control, and that is all part of the effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost became so devastating, sunk a new reality for leaders of a few different nations. As the Cold War makes its way into the 1980s, a couple of new leaders come to the forefront. Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, one the leader of the United States, and Ronald Reagan, and then Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union. They develop a good relationship, which does go to show the thawing of the Cold War, despite the fact that there still is a Cold War. That's really important to note. However, both countries have been pouring vast sums of money into their economy to keep up with the arms race. That has now hurt, in some ways, both countries for sure. It's just a lot of money pouring in, but the Soviet Union has a number of issues going on within it as well. In fact, when Mikhail Gorbachev, in his reign, comes to an end, he's basically banished. So during his time, he was not appreciated whatsoever by the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union has issues going on. Not only is their economy not working for them, but there has been a lot of corruption throughout, and certainly during Mikhail Gorbachev's reign. The lack of control in Eastern Europe. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union had satellite states. So they were in control of not just Eastern Germany, but a lot of those Eastern European nations. And those Eastern European nations are fighting back. They are looking for their independence, and that lack of control has the Soviet Union hurting as well. Political problems exist, lack of science and technology, the lack of advancements that are taking place. Keep in mind the Soviet Union, when it came to the space race, jumped out ahead of the United States early on in the 1950s. That's not happening anymore. And with all these things combined, we see the end of the Soviet Union. It happens after Ronald Reagan's presidency, but the Soviet Union does collapse, and it brings an end to the Cold War. That's it. This brings an end to the video on nuclear weapons part 1. It's the end of the Cold War, but certainly not the end of nuclear weapons as a world issue. So, where do we go from here? The next video will take a look at pros and cons of the nuclear weapons argument. We'll take a look at different proliferation cases. So we're talking about the spread of nuclear weapons. And then we'll also take a look at who exactly all has nuclear weapons today. That's it. See you next time. Bye-bye.